I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, in a small fishing village, there once lived a poor peasant called Young. Young had been left an orphan at an early age and had been brought up by his brother and sister-in-law, who indeed were just as poor as he. They, like the rest of the village, had barely enough food to feed themselves and their family, let alone a growing lad like Young. He tried to work for smallholders, but they had no money to pay with, and could only give him the occasional bowl of rice, certainly not enough to feed his relatives. At last, his brother and sister-in-law had to tell him that they could no longer afford to keep him, but that they would try to find him a job in a neighbouring village. So they all went to the richest merchant in that nearby village, a man who employed many workers, to find out if he could give some work to Young. Kim, the merchant's only daughter, was immediately struck by Young's good looks. The old man noticed Kim's admiring glances, and while he had first refused to give Young a job, telling him that he had enough workers already, his daughter's melting looks softened his own heart, and he agreed to take the lad on a trial basis. So Young was given his chance. He said goodbye to his relatives, vowing that he would work hard to prove himself. The kindly merchant explained what he had to do and introduced him to all his fellow workers from the foreman downwards. They saw the favour the master showed the new man, and they were very jealous. None more so than the foreman. He had taken an instant dislike to Young and gave him the most menial tasks to do. It didn't take the foreman long to see Kim's languishing looks for Young, and as it so happened, the foreman wanted to marry Kim himself, as much for her wealth as her beauty, and was furious that she seemed to favour Young. As far as the merchant was concerned, he was delighted with Young's diligence and aptitude. He soon learnt everything there was to learn in the workshop. He worked hard and long. It seemed that the foreman invented work for Young, and that no matter what Young did, the foreman found fault. It was almost like a game. Young would be told to do something. He would do it. The foreman would not be satisfied. He would criticize Young. Young would hold back his temper. The foreman would offer a useless suggestion. Young would make no comment. He just continued to work hard. There was no way he would allow himself to be provoked. The more the foreman challenged Young, the more Young restrained himself. The foreman enjoyed aggravating Young. He continued to belittle his work. He found mistakes where none existed. He was relentless in his accusations of Young's incompetence. Young's ability to ignore these lies was further proof of the strength of his character. The foreman sneered at Young's accomplishments. He gave him no credit, regardless of his efforts. He showed a particular talent for figures. In fact, he was far better at doing the accounts than the foreman. As the weeks went by, the merchant gave Young more and more responsibility, a fact that did not escape the foreman's jealous notice. His dislike of Young grew with the lad's increasing favour in the master's eyes, but even the foreman could not hide Young's ability. The merchant observed his progress and was delighted with his new employee. He saw what an honest, hard-working boy Young was, and he rewarded him accordingly. After Young had proved time and time again how completely trustworthy he was, the merchant at last gave him a very great responsibility. He asked Young to look after the keys of his treasure chest. Young, of course, felt greatly honoured by this trust, while, for his part, the merchant found himself relying more and more on the young man's advice in all his business dealings. He regarded Young almost as a son, the person who could carry on the business when he himself had retired. For it hadn't escaped the old man's eyes that Kim, his beautiful daughter, still looked with such favour on Young. And indeed he couldn't blame her. He too liked this handsome young man very much. As time passed, Young's fellow workers too liked him more and more, except of course the foreman. Kim continued to show what she felt about Young in many ways, while he too found himself falling deeper in love with this lively young girl. There was no disguising any more the feelings they had for each other, and they began to speak of the time when Young had earned enough money for them to marry. Kim's thoughts were full of Young, while he was determined to prove that he was a worthy suitor for the rich merchant's beautiful daughter and would be able to give her a fine home and all the luxury she had been used to in her father's house. Now the foreman had long believed that the rich merchant would give Kim's hand to him as a reward for all his hard work, and the sight of Kim and Young together drove him into a frenzy of jealous rage. All had been well, he thought, until this young upstart had appeared and wormed his way into the master's favour and into Kim's affections. He, the foreman, was going to put a stop to it for once and for all. Seizing his opportunity while the old man took his afternoon siesta, the foreman stole a bag of gold from the merchant's treasure chest. He sneaked into the old man's room and as quietly sneaked out again carrying the gold, the merchant being not one whit the wiser about the robbery. It only took a matter of minutes for the foreman to hide the stolen bag in Young's bedroll. Then nonchalantly, as if nothing had happened, the foreman went back to work as arrogantly as ever. As Young and the old man were now almost inseparable, it was quite easy for the foreman, once the theft had been discovered, to institute a search right under Young's and the merchant's very eyes. And the foreman began his charade. He got down on his hands and knees and craftily conducted this mock search until he felt the time was ripe for a discovery of the missing gold in Young's bedroll. Despite Young's innocent look, the evil man was confident that here was proof positive that the young man was not to be trusted. But, to his astonishment, the rich merchant declared nonetheless that he did trust Young and believed him when he vowed he had no idea how the bag of gold had slipped into his bedroll. The foreman could not and would not give up his persecution of Young. The foreman was furious at this turn of events. He confronted the merchant and declared, "We do not wish to work with a thief. You may believe Young, but we do not. If you do not dismiss him, then all your staff will leave. If he is not guilty, then who is? You are saying, in effect, that one of us stole the gold." This deeply disturbed the old man. Once again he assured Young that he personally believed in his integrity, but told Young that his business would be ruined if all his staff left him. "Better for you to leave and prove your innocence, my dear boy," he advised. "Come back to me when you have made your own way in the world, and I promise you that you will marry my daughter." Kim was heartbroken to learn that her dearest Young had to leave, and although he vowed that he would return to her as soon as he could and claim her for his bride, it took a long, long time for Kim to be consoled over her loss. As for her father, he was greatly distressed that such a promising young man had had to leave under a cloud of suspicion. Sadly, Young retraced his steps back to his brother's home and told them what had happened at the rich merchant's. He assured them that he had worked hard and honestly and that he had not stolen the bag of gold, although he thought he knew who did. And he again vowed his determination to prove his innocence to everyone. So it was arranged that he would travel to another village and work for one of his uncles who had a prosperous business there. was not an easy task for Young to have to go and seek help from his uncle. He had wanted to become successful on his own, and while he looked on this setback as a personal defeat, he knew that eventually he would prove himself worthy. The old man was very pleased to see Young, for he was getting on, and he needed somebody to help him with his work. Young was very careful to explain every detail of what had happened. His uncle was extremely sympathetic. Equally important was his uncle's attitude of family loyalty. Young was his nephew, and while he would have to prove his worth, he would certainly be given the opportunity. Young, for his part, promised to work hard and justify his uncle's trust. So the bargain was happily struck between the two. As at the rich merchant's, Young soon showed what a diligent, hard-working young man he was. And this time he had a further motive. He had to remove that cloud of suspicion that hung over him, so that he would be a worthy husband for Kim. So each day he worked hard at his uncle's fruit stall. All the villagers grew to like and respect the cheery young man, who never shortchanged them and only sold them the best produce at the fairest prices. His honesty and business acumen soon became a byword throughout the whole village. His uncle, for his part, entrusted more and more of the day-to-day work to Young. He was planning to retire, and he decided that when he did so, all his business and all his property would go to Young. At the rich merchant's home, Kim continued to mourn for her lost love and paid no attention to the foreman, who was becoming more and more persistent, forcing himself on the young girl until at last, in fury, she told her father about the man's unwelcome advances. Her father was angry indeed at the foreman's boorish behavior to his only daughter and sternly berated him. But the man took no notice. He began drinking heavily. He took no interest in his work. He didn't oversee the men and let everything go to rack and ruin. He insulted all the customers. He stole money. He ruined the fine work made in the workshops. He did everything he could to break the man who had been so kind to him. At last the merchant realized that things could not carry on in this way. He summoned the police to arrest this criminal and imprison him before the merchant was utterly ruined. But by this time it was already too late. This evil man's ill will had truly ruined the merchant. There was no business left. The two of them could no longer live in their fine house, but in a squalid little hut on the river's edge. Then another tragedy struck. His beautiful daughter Kim became blind. In spite of her blindness, she would try and weave some cloth, while her father, exhausted by grief, slept most of the time. If it hadn't been for the kindly attentions of their neighbours, Kim and her father would surely have starved in their poverty. But in the midst of her misfortune, Kim did not berate her father. She took her affliction bravely, always pleased to hear when friends arrived to visit them, always trying to comfort her father with words of courage. Now Young found himself to be a rich man, and as he felt that he had proved himself, he lost no time in hurrying to his home village. After he had repaid his brother much more than he owed him, he set off eagerly to find Kim once more. Alas, an old friend had to tell him what misfortune had befallen Kim and her father. The sight of Kim, sitting in her poor hut, her eyes forever dark, tore at Young's heart. Although she could no longer see, she immediately recognized the familiar voice, and her hands told her what her eyes no longer could. Young had come back to her. Young, for his part, assured her that she was as beautiful as ever, and that he still intended to marry her without delay and look after her and her old father for the rest of their lives. His courage was never stronger, and his love was never greater.